What's up, everybody? How's it going? I'm Brad Dollar, producer, engineer, and coach. Welcome back to the channel. It's awesome to see you. Recently, I got a question from a subscriber that I see and hear all the time, and that is, does analog recording and mixing matter, and how does it stack up against digital recording and mixing? It's a fantastic question, but it has so many rabbit holes and caveats that are specific to the kind of music that's being made, where it's being made, what you have access to, and really what your vision is as a creator. The question can feel so serious and like a roadblock at times because many of our decisions around workflow and budget require us to decide if we're going to be more analog focused, more digital focused, or a hybrid of the two. I've been really lucky in my time as a producer and engineer to get to make a bunch of different music on tape. In this video, I'll be pulling on all of my experiences on those records and many more, as well as my knowledge of working between digital and analog and combining them together to help you make a more informed decision about which one works best for you, if it matters to the music that you want to make, and how to maximize your choices no matter which way you go. This is not going to be a technical analysis, it's just the opinion of a guy who's made a bunch of music on tape. So for a more in-depth look, I highly recommend you Google search and YouTube search any interviews and lectures with Andrew Scheps on the topic of analog versus digital. He's put out a lot of great information and conversations about this, and you can also find other great info from other YouTubers and channels as well. But before we get started, it would mean a lot to me if you can hit the like button and the subscribe button, because it would let the YouTube algorithm know I even exist and to bring this info on analog versus digital to more producers, creators, engineers, and makers just like yourself. It means a lot to me and I thank you a ton for doing it. So without further ado, let's get going. First and foremost, the most important thing about choosing analog or digital or a combination of both in 2021 is that it comes down to choosing a sound that works best for the music that you make. That's really all that matters. There are no rules, and you can use any amount of either one in any combination that you really want. So just know that you can do whatever you want when it comes to this, and if you're inspired by one side of it and you want to blend it with the other, I highly recommend you do that, because ultimately that's what's going to evolve the art and craft of recording and producing music anyways. So that's really important for you to know, just so you can feel like a breath of fresh air, like no stress, okay? So really quickly, on the most basic level, the difference between analog and digital is how they accomplish the task at hand of processing audio. Whether that's amplification, attenuation, distortion, equalization, compression, both are effectively achieving the same result, but going about it in vastly different ways. So don't get confused on what their overall intended purpose is at the end. It's really just what goes on in the middle that's different. At the end of the day, in either format, your goal is to capture acoustic sound, store it, play it back whenever you want, and have it come back out through a pair of speakers back into the real world as a new acoustic sound. That's it. When we talk about how analog and digital approach audio processing, one of the biggest things we're talking about is components. For example, a tube guitar amplifier versus a solid-state guitar amplifier. They're both doing the same thing. They're amplifying an electric guitar. They both have equalization. They usually have distortion, maybe some effects, but they're using different components to achieve that. Analog components do all of their work without using any sort of microprocessing. Sure, there are lots of combinations of the two. In fact, this Moog Little Fatty is an analog synth, but with digital controls that they can be saved and retained, but the actual functionality is all analog. The filters are all based on capacitors and resistors and real voltage happening inside. So if you're just zooming out and you're trying to look at analog versus digital and make a choice about the sound of it, it's really about the components. And one of the great things about where we are right now in technology is much of the digital technology that's coming out is trying to model analog technology by looking at those components. So every day we're getting a greater sense of what makes this classic gear tick and how we can make more of those sounds in the digital realm. Now let's talk about why we love the sound and why we even compare either one. The first thing that we have to get straight is that before digital recording came along, analog recording was just called recording. So the essence of what they both do never really changed. Again, it's just the way in which those processes were completed. And it was the difficulty of how those processes were completed that pushed so many developers and producers and engineers into wanting digital gear. Analog, back in its beginnings between the 30s and the late 70s, it got easier and easier as time went on, but it was definitely difficult. It was very linear. Analog is a very linear process. You can't move things around in time. Editing is very hard. It's very destructive. So every time you make a move or you change something, you could be affecting everything. So it's a very fragile process. And so a whole different skill set and mindset was brought to recording when analog, quote unquote, because it was just called recording at the time, was the mainstay. So a lot of creators almost immediately wanted to push the bounds. Les Paul wanted more tracks. The Beatles wanted to overdub things in a different way. By the late 70s, many artists were starting to program drums and synthesizers. So near peak analog, it was becoming very, very apparent that tape machines and those workflows were going to have a really hard time keeping up with modern production techniques. And so that demand for faster workflow, more tracks, the ability to recall, and the use of synthesizers really propelled digital technology to the forefront and made it a mainstay of how music was made almost overnight. And in that same time frame, much of the analog gear that we love now was just basically thrown in a dumpster. In fact, Brent Averill Enterprises was kind of started on Brent Averill dumpster diving around Los Angeles in the 80s and pulling out all these old Neve consoles that no one even wanted because people weren't really aware yet of that difference between analog versus digital. They saw the workflow and they thought, oh, ones and zeros, it's doing exactly what it says it's doing. It's copying the sound exactly one for one. That must be it. We don't need any of that stuff. And so we abandoned that. And what it did was it created an era where that analog sauce, that goo, those real components, those real physical things doing real physical things to our sound, which is also real and physical, it was lost for a little while and people were starting to miss that. Digital has never been great on its own in its basic form at really capturing low end and high end and ambience the way that our ears truly do. Analog equipment from tubes to tape is so much better at it. And so very quickly by the mid 90s, you had a big falling out between analog versus digital and people were really kind of sick of that digital sound and it started to become a big issue. And by the mid 2000s, you really had a revival of analog gear and people getting really interested in a lot of different pieces of equipment that have been forgotten. And if you jump forward now to 2021, you can see people are really getting fixated on smaller elements of that technology and just moving their focus up in the decades. For example, the Tascam Portastudio 4-track is a highly sought after piece of analog processing equipment right now. I remember being a kid and going into Guitar Center and there were just stacks of them for like $60 and they couldn't give them away because everyone just wanted Pro Tools rigs and inboxes and things like that. And now it's like you can go on Reverb and there's several $100s in okay condition. Which brings me to a very important point about analog gear. In my opinion, has a lot to do with nostalgia, feel, and perception. When you understand that a LA2A or a Fairchild was used on an album or a song, as you're using that gear, you can put your own mind and ears in that space and sort of hear that magic. And when you hear it, you embed that energy back into that music you're working on. It's just is kind of the nature of the beast. You start to make choices that resemble that, and all of a sudden you have music that you're making fresh, which feels very familiar. Because the lion's share of music across time and space has been captured in a mostly analog fashion. So our ears just gravitate towards it. It's just how we're conditioned. Even kids nowadays, still to this day, when 11-year-olds hear Pink Floyd records and Nirvana records, they freak out because they can hear a difference. So I do think that a big part of the analog versus digital thing comes from wanting to embody a part of yesteryear that's gone and to bring that into now with the understanding that analog gear has a very special sound that imparts a character you don't have to struggle or search for. It's just there. And that's the biggest advantage analog has over digital, is that it has immediate character, whereas digital is just a blank slate and you get to create the character. That's kind of the exciting part, right? You get to infinitely do whatever you want to it to make it do the thing that you want it to do, whether it's an edit or a crazy effect or something automated or something programmed or just something just out of this world. Digital gives you that clean palette to do that, whereas anything analog shows up and it's already got a flavor and a color on it, and it's your choice to decide if you want to use that and how much of it you want to use. So the thing that helps digital also kind of hurts it, and the thing that helps analog also kind of hurts it. It's important to know that the engineers, producers in the 80s were excited about digital because it meant that noise was gone, that they could stop fighting with their Dolby units and decoding and encoding to make sure that noise reduction worked, because tape is noisy. And it wasn't really until the end of the 80s, early 90s where tape machines really got to a point where they were so quiet that it was like, okay. So it's important to just keep that in perspective, that things that push people away from analog are now calling people back into it. I mean, there's many plugins that have like noise and stuff built into it, so you can actually simulate that because your ear sort of like wants to hear that. And digital just doesn't have that. And when you do hear digital noise, it's like terrible. It sounds like the worst thing ever. And maybe that will be in vogue someday. But right now we tend to gravitate towards more of that analog character, and that usually is what makes us choose it over digital. And lastly, one of the biggest things that differentiates analog from digital is the workflow. With analog recording being so linear, you really have to map and plot out exactly what you want to accomplish before you ever hit record. It also forces creators to be much more sure of the song they're making in the first place. Now, you can definitely build a song from scratch on tape with no pre-planning and just plug stuff in, and you can definitely do it, but it's way harder. Any sort of intense editing or flying parts around or compiling parts to make a new version of something. All of that is extremely difficult on tape and can take hours of your time. Those same tasks can be completed in moments in digital, as well as not having that pressure to make decisions on the fly as much. Again, both things are helpful and hurtful. Not having to make decisions doesn't always help our music, right? Like, it's nice about analog that you have to decide what you want to do. It's nice that you have to really dial things in, make sonic choices, commit to sounds, commit to parts. It's really great that we have to do that. It's actually some of those limitations that can help lift us into a new level of creativity. And if we step aside for a moment from talking about big studios and the way old records were made, and we just talk about how analog and digital shows up in your life, workflow is very, very important for you to get your head wrapped around because it will force you to make decisions about how you want to make your music. Going back to our guitar example, a very common choice that many players, including myself, have to make pretty much every song that we work on is whether or not we're going to mic up an amplifier or just plug in direct and use a modeled amplifier. Both give different feelings and both have different sounds, but one is very final and the other is extremely flexible. And the truth is, you can have both, but it's important to know that ahead of time that you even want both so you can prepare your studio accordingly. For example, I'm probably never going to record a piano in this space, so I'm not really going to make preparations to have preamps for piano or to get some really nice Audix SCX25 piano miking system. I don't really need that in my space. I could spend that same money getting a great MIDI keyboard, a great soft synth, or maybe I could buy a Nord or something and get a nice DI. So whatever that choice may be, knowing what you want to accomplish in your space really help you make a better choice. Also, as it relates to many of our home spaces, getting analog gear in the space is as affordable as I think it's ever going to be. The fact that companies like Warm Audio exist and you can get a copy of a LA2A or an 1176 for under $1,000 is insane. The fact that you can get a pretty close approximation of a Neve for under $1,000 in your home studio is incredible. And so marrying that technology with, say, you're very Ableton Live focused, you can do that very easily. And all that you really have to decide upon is what you want to make, what you want to do. If you want to make really cool 80s guitar, EDM pop, you can definitely do that. Cases like that, you would definitely want a hybrid solution. You would for sure want to be able to program drums and have keys set up, but also be able to record some guitar and maybe even record some analog keyboards into your system. On the flip side, you might decide that you really don't want to record on a computer at all in your home studio, and you just want to get like an Otari MX5050, or maybe like a cool little Studer 2-track, or a Tascam 388, or a Porta Studio, which many artists and engineers do. And if that's you, then it's a great time to think about the workflow you want, to understand that if you're recording on those formats, you need to make a plan and have a roadmap for how you're going to build your songs, for how you're going to set things up and dial things in, and to get into a different mindset of creativity, because you're going to have to make many more choices and decisions that you commit to forever. So what I want you to take away from this is that there are many different combinations available to you. And ultimately, maybe the best decision is that a hybrid solution is what's right for you. Very few of us have the time or space or capacity to really only work in one format or the other. Being exclusively analog requires a tremendous amount of gear. Maybe it doesn't have to be expensive, but you need a lot more of it. And being exclusively digital may be cheap, but will require more of your musicianship, more of your know-how and think power to really make arrangements come to life and have the character that really makes people fall in love with songs instead of just being simple programmed ones and zeros and MIDI lines that you draw in. Both have incredible merits, and I think as you discover what works best for you, you'll come to the conclusion that analog does matter. It's just up to you to decide in what capacity and how much you really deploy it. And ultimately, you will probably find that a hybrid solution of both is what's going to help you get your vision out of your brain and coming through speakers. That's my personal solution. I love combining the two worlds. I think they work in tandem beautifully. And nowadays, with the advent of the Universal Audio plugins, digital processing has come a long way, and these plugins sound fantastic. Maybe it's not exactly like the real thing, but when you start to really zoom out and listen to a song and everything's gone through some of these analog emulations that are really just digital, it starts to impart that character, and all of a sudden it actually feels like something new because both worlds are blending together in harmony. And I really think that's what the future is for audio and for music production. It's a blend of analog and digital coming together into something new that we can't even imagine yet. Every single year, analog emulations and digital advancements marry themselves closer and closer together, like the Universal Audio Luna platform and recent classics like the Moog Little Fatty. That's an analog synth, but it's digitally controlled. The possibilities are really endless. And all it's doing is opening up more doors for new music to be made, stuff that we've never heard or never even imagined. And that's the most exciting part about this debate, about analog versus digital, because the real winner in all of this are audiences and listeners and fans of music all over the world across time and space. So that's my take on if analog matters or not. I definitely think that it does, and I really believe that it lives in harmony wonderfully with digital processes, with DAWs, and both worlds coming together is really the best way to get most ideas to come to life with as little stress and pressure as possible. So that's it for me for now. I'd love to know what you think. I'd love to know if you think analog matters and what your process is and what your workflow is, and maybe what kind of gear you're thinking about buying or questions you may have. And if it's something I can cover or talk about on this channel, I definitely will. So I really appreciate you watching. Thanks for being here. Hope you have a great rest of your day and to see you soon. Thanks so much. Bye.